Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this is my old Challenger. Again! But this time it's shiny. The last time I saw my old Challenger, well, that was the day I picked up this car from my friend Belle James, who often haunts our Sunday live streams. No, I don't want to talk about the bushes that are eating this thing right now. That's this whole other issue. At the time, he just happened to mention that there was a 73 Challenger on the property. He said it was primer gray. I asked if it used to be yellow, and eventually he got back to me and said, well, yes. Given that the car was at that time in the same city that I had sold it to someone in, I figured it was probably my car. And lo, it was. When I saw it at that time, all of the goofy metal issues had been fixed. This rear window filler panel, which my wife bought me for Christmas like 6 or 7 years ago. I keep telling people that was a Christmas present. It was a birthday present. I know, that's a very important detail. Had been welded into the car, and the seams were all sealed, as you see now. Oh, also it's got a new trunk lid. But at that time, it was primer gray. Now it's shiny gloss black. Gloss black is tough to get right. Apparently it wasn't all that nice off the gun, but it looks pretty decent now. There aren't any like horrible flaws, except for a spot under the gas filler, which is really unfortunate. Much like Dale's Demon, this Challenger was an original 344 speed car. It was also originally yellow. It was a rally, which means it's got the thingies on the fenders, and it would have had black strobe stripes down the doors. When I had it, all that was gone, and it had been resprayed yellow. I got to thinking about this yesterday, and I dug up some historical Challenger photos. Here's one. This is like 2017. Note the black stripes that were all over the car when I got it. Also, the baby. Lumpy hood. I painstakingly removed all of those black stripes by hand. In fact, there was another one here. You could just see the ghost of it. Ultimately, I got it shined up and looking pretty good. Not as good as the phone camera made it look, but still, pretty good. I realized today the fender tag's actually still in place, which is really neat. Of course, as discussed in the first video on the car, the original 340 is long gone. It's been gone for like decades. In its place is this 400 short deck big block. It's a 1972 engine, so it's pretty early. As discussed in that last video I did on this car, it was kind of sort of for sale. I couldn't justify the expense myself. I've never really been an E-body guy. I love this car and I love driving it, but I don't know. They're not as spacious and practical as, say, a B-body. So I didn't buy it. It was painted and then it was sold to someone else. So how did it end up back here? YouTube, of course. The new owner, Casey, found my last video and went, hey, I think that was my car. And he managed to find my email address, reached out to me, and sure enough, here it is. It's here with me today to deal with a few small issues. Well, one of them's kind of a medium-large issue. More on that in a minute. Number 1, no gas cage. Hey, before you E-body experts run to the comments to tell me that this is not a rally cage cluster and that this car should have one, yeah, I know. I installed this years ago, and there's kind of an interesting story behind that, which I'll share later in this very video. There's a video on Chrysler fuel gauges and, by extension, temperature and oil gauges in the Mopar Electrical Guides playlist that you can find on my channel. So I'm not going to rehash all of those details, but I am going to show you the tests I go through to figure out what's wrong with this one. Another issue is blinkers. They used to kind of sort of work, and they don't at all now. The left side shows nothing. The right side flasher in the cluster lights up, but it doesn't flash. The flasher unit is new, so we can go ahead and rule that out. I have a guess. Yep, confirmed. The front bulb isn't lighting. I bet you, $8. It's a ground problem. I actually went through this issue on the video on Ralph's 69 Charger, the ratty one, like a year ago. It's the same deal. This light has to ground through this screw to do light stuff, and that screw is missing. The new owner, Casey, has done a lot of nice little things to bring this car up to snuff, and he's still working on it. For example, he's got new bumpers on the way. We're going to see about getting him set up to do the rear bumper tuck as I did on the front here. That's where you use the earlier brackets to pull the bumper in toward the body, and then you can eliminate the goofy filler piece that's supposed to be found on a 73. It's probably obvious from some of the details that this is not a restoration job. It's just going to be a nice driver. So that's the goal. There's one other tiny little issue, and that is this thing runs like garbage. When I owned this car, this 400 big block was the bane of my existence. I went through so many different issues thinking, aha, this must be it. This must be the problem. I'll fix this, and this car is going to run awesome. That never happened. I never got to the bottom of what was wrong with the thing. Here's what would happen. If you were easy on it, putting around, it would run fine. You might even be able to coax it into doing a burnout here or there, but if you really tried to get on it, it would backfire out the carb, or cough. It was just never right. This car had points on it at one time. It had factory electronic ignition on it at one time. Then I converted it to HEI, which is actually still here. It's been through 2 or 3 HEI modules. It's been through multiple electronic distributors, and still this problem has persisted. I had this car way back when I didn't really know so much. I mean, I knew some things, but I know a whole lot more now. At that time, though, someone told me, a flattened cam lobe could possibly cause that issue. When I was changing the head gaskets for an unrelated reason, I decided to pull the cam out and just go ahead and change that. Changing the cam did nothing. The cam that came out was perfectly fine, and I actually later installed that in a 383. And even more has happened. For one thing, you might hear that issue and think, aha, vacuum leak. Well, you'd be about the 4th person to think about that. I've looked for that. The last owner looked for that. The current owner has looked for that. There's no sign of a vacuum leak anywhere, but all sorts of things have been changed just in case. The car used to have a bad brake booster. Do you think replacing that fixed the problem? No. The carburetor's been changed multiple times. That's a brand new double pumper Holly. Hasn't gotten any better yet. In fact, it's actually running worse than I remember, so that's cool. Car never had this when I owned it. It really needed to, though. It does have the factory type dual tips now, which is pretty cool, but I miss the side dumps. Anyway, I'm gonna fire it up. Let's see if it bursts into flames again. Not this time, but here. Yeah, there you go. It doesn't run so good. Kinda sorta sounds like one dead cylinder most of the time. And then sometimes there's fire. So I got to thinking, and I broke out my fancy thermal imager, which I do feel the need to remind you I didn't actually pay for. I'm free with a scanner that I don't even have anymore. Temperatures look good here on the passenger side. I don't know if you can see that, but anyway. Yeah, that looks cold, but it's only because it's so far down the tube. There's temperature up here. That's all fine. Over here, though, things are a little more interesting. Let me know when you spot it. Yeah, there are 2 cylinders in the middle there, and one of them is dead cold. Great. Now it's hot. Anyway, I feel the need to point out all the tune-up parts are new, like these fancy Taylor cables. That's really nice. The plugs have like 200 miles on them. Cap and rotor similarly have been replaced. These are the same crappy old headers that were on it when I had it, but Casey actually took these things off, stripped them, and carefully painted them with VHT. That'll be gone soon enough because that's what happens to header paint, but it looks nice now. These plug wires definitely need some of those high temperature condoms. That boot is like on that primary tube. I'm gonna get this wire out of here somehow without burning the crap out of myself, and we'll figure that out. Yeah, it's definitely getting melted, but I don't see any actual evidence of arcing, burn, crispy spots. It's just melty. Did I mention these headers are terrible? It's possible to get to some of the spark plugs, but some others, not so much. I was telling the owner when he dropped it off about the different swear words I invented trying to change the plugs in this car. I can't get my spark plug socket to it because it's too fancy and it has a magnet, which is covered in chunks of metal and it doesn't work. Anyway, a standard 13/16 socket got in there, so that's the good news. Burning myself more. Please hold. There we go. Yes. Here's number 5 plug. Super, mega, ultra rich and sooty. Part of that is because he had the idle mixture screws out too far. This is a 4-corner idle system, and well, they didn't need to be out as far as they are. I'll just say that. This thing was billowing smoke when it got here, and I've already fixed that, but I don't know if that's the only issue. So I'm gonna do something I never do and grab the compression tester. Long-time watchers of the channel will know I usually don't do this. I'll just listen to an engine and try and pick out any differences in cylinder evenness. But in this case, plug's already out. Contact. Oh yeah. Okay. Not a compression issue, so I think it's just a nasty fouled plug. Well, when I say not a compression issue, 115 PSI, dry, throttle closed. Yeah. All right, 120 PSI. That's gonna be on the tired side. Number 7, also fouled to crap. At least it's consistent. All right, number 7, right next to it, exactly the same reading, which again, little on the tired side, but not bad. And given that number 7 had plenty of temperature there, I'm gonna say this is probably not an actual mechanical issue. I think last year, we had this weird deal with a 68 Roadrunner that had a horrible miss and backfiring like that. And it turned out to be a fouled plug, a diagnosis that to this day makes no sense to me. But yeah, I guess my next move is to put a set of spark plugs in this thing, which, as I believe I've mentioned, giant pain. Can't wait. I'm pretty much out of time for tonight anyway, so we'll just let this thing sit here, cool down, and think about what it's done. And we'll get back to this tomorrow. Well, it's Monday morning. The last time I touched this car was late Thursday. I've pretty much been inoperable since then. Today's Labor Day. Happy Labor Day, I guess. Anyway, I've got all the plugs out. Good news! They all look even. Consistency, that's key. The bad news, of course, they're all evenly, completely pitch black. So, I've got new plugs on the way. We're gonna slap those in and see if that improves things at all. New spark plugs appeared as if by magic. Now, my friend Joe, with the channel Just Mopar Joe, is a brilliant engine builder, racer, just all around great guy. And he has a saying, champions don't run champions. Personally, I've always been partial to champions. 1, because they tend to be very cheap. And 2, because it's what Chrysler installed originally. And if it's good enough for Chrysler, and was for literally decades, it's probably good enough for me. His point is that these cheapo champion plugs tend to foul out and not come back. And I kind of think that's actually what happened here. Clearly, we have a fouling issue, and hopefully we're going to address the tune-up problem today. But in any case, I want to go with a less horrible plug. So I got some of these NGK V-Powers. They weren't expensive either. These are actually the cheapest plugs that my local parts store carries. So I had them delivered, and I'm going to throw them in the engine. I'm going to verify that these gaps are around 32 thou. Now, we do have an HEI ignition and a high-performance coil on this car, so I could open those up to like 50. And that might help, maybe. But I have half a mind that the HEI might actually be part of the problem here. So I don't know yet, but I may investigate other ignition options. For now, I'm going to leave them at the stock spec, just in case we go back to a Mopar box. New plugs installed. I don't have fancy high temp boots for the plug wires like I was talking about, but I did add some extra zip ties to hopefully keep these wires over here off the steering and kind of off the header. Fresh spark plugs and the idle screws adjusted in. Not that they're necessarily perfect just yet, but they're closer. Cold start. I am not going to use the manual choke. For one thing, I think those are silly, but anyway. Why does the starter sound like that? Hey, that sounds pretty good. Not perfect, but it sounds like 8 happy cylinders, so that's a good start. One might expect cold starting a big block with no choke to be a little rough. And this thing's already idling. Super high, incidentally. This thing doesn't have a functional parking brake. I might have mentioned that. Anyway, that works. It sure wasn't idling this high before. I hear a very slight exhaust leak, I think over on the passenger side. That should not come as any surprise. Notice the carb spacer makes this not good. Also notice this thing is missing the specific Chrysler Holly throttle adapter. This cable needs to be here. This car may not even get full throttle like this. Sounds pretty happy. Now we need to check the timing, reset these mixture screws, and go from there. It's warmed up a little bit, and I found the best idle mixture setting is 3/4 of a turnout on every screw. That sounds about right to me. Wow. I have never heard this thing run so well. We've definitely got temperature out of 5 now. Incidentally, it's still colder than 3 there. Listening to the thing, it's definitely not missing. I'm gonna say it's fine for now and keep running it. When I say definitely not missing, mind that, but I really don't want to lose a finger. Also, I installed this radiator in this car years ago. It was brand new. Came with it. I learned this trick years ago from Uncle Tony. Take the test light with it connected to ground and slide it in between the wire and the boot on the cap on a spark plug that leads to a cylinder that you find suspect. Let's see if I can do that here for number 5. Okay. You see the sparks? Did you hear the engine dip? It does dip. Let's try another cylinder. Let's do 4. Does that sound the same as this? Very, very similar. Okay, so 5 is definitely contributing. Could be a little weak, but it's definitely contributing. You saw me check the compression, so we know it's definitely at least mostly fine. So, I'm gonna call that good and move on. I've talked at length about the throttle issue for aftermarket carbs, specifically with an eye toward these Edelbrock Carter type units, but the Holly has the same situation. To get the cable lined up correctly, you really need an adapter bracket. Of course, I keep the Edelbrock ones in stock. The Holly type, not so much. The issue is one of pedal ratio. The throttle pedal travel in a Mopar is peculiar. With the throttle pin here, you're likely not going to get full throttle opening. With it moved down to this position, you should. And as you can see, that's what was done on the Demon here. So, went with my typical move. Enlarged that hole one size over 3/16. I don't know why the screw wouldn't fit through 3/16, but anyway, it's some weird number of 64ths. There's one nut securing the screw to the throttle. Then the throttle cable sits here in the middle, and it can move. It's somewhat tight, but it is not locked tight. You don't want to do that. It could put undue stress on that ball. You want it to be able to move around. And then there's a nut, and then there's a second nut which locks that in place. This should hang on, works really well. It's simple, elegant, and the parts were free. I also bent the bracket somewhat to get the cable a little bit more in line. It should be like straight-ish, but this is gonna work fine. Full throttle test. No, not even close. This was just about at the end of its adjustment before to reach all the way forward to this stud in the wrong place. So now I should be able to set it something like that. And we'll see if that works. Obviously, some fine tuning from here is gonna be necessary. Now we flood the crap out of it a little bit more. Look at that. It's okay with my foot like in the firewall. I think that's about 95% throttle. Nice. You want to be able to reach 100, but you don't want to be able to go past because that'll put stress on the throttle cable's ball as well. I've seen a good few of those pop off in the past, which is not what you want. I eked it back just a touch farther, and now it's perfect. You may have noticed that when I rev this thing up, there's a little bit of a hiccup. It just doesn't quite sound awesome enough. Just a slight stumble. Not horrible, but definitely noticeable. It's the first Monday of the month, and the tsunami alarm made me crap my pants a little bit. At least it's only a test. Anyway, every one of these double pumper Hollies that I have seen has the same exact problem. For some reason, on the primary side, they ship with a 28 squirter nozzle. Properly known as an accelerator pump discharge nozzle, this is the piece with small holes that releases the fuel from the accelerator pump circuit into the carburetor. Now, there are many ways to tune the accelerator pump on a Holly. You can change the pump itself out for the bigger one, for example. There are tunable and replaceable cams here, which actuate this arm, which pushes on the pump, which is what sends the fuel up to the nozzle. However, what I have found is that the 28 discharge nozzle is just too small for like every situation I've ever encountered. There are much, much larger nozzles you can install, but the 31, which is the same as is installed in the secondary side of most of these carburetors, including this one, is like perfect. So that's my super secret Holly tuning trick. Take the 28 squirter out, put the 31 in, and it's probably gonna be good. Obviously, you can continue to tune from there. Now, of course, the secondary squirter is really easy to get to, but somebody decided to put a choke in the way of the primary one, so this is a little tricky. You take your Phillips screwdriver of decent size, it's a pretty big screw, as you can see on that back one, and you loosen it. Carefully. Do not knock it out of there. You'll have a bad time if you do. Once the screw is totally loose, carefully take your screwdriver out. Now, you need to extract it. And what I use for that is a long pair of needle nose pliers. It will not come straight out because it hits this breather. So what you need to do is carefully grab the body of the squirter with the screw still in it, lift it up slightly, carefully dance it over here, and bring it straight out. I am not going to do this on camera because if I attempt to do it on camera, I'm going to drop the screw and then I'm going to have a bad time. But with the camera off, it comes right out, no problem. Notice it's all black and soaked in fuel and horrible. Anyway, I don't know why the numbers are stamped upside down, but they are. You can see the one I just took out says 28. And the new one I'm going to pop in says 31. That's out of my collection of crap. I'll probably be really upset that I donated it to the cause here sometime in the future, but there we are. Also note the screw on the left there with its special conical head gasket thing. Make sure all of that comes out together and goes into the new one. There's also a flat gasket underneath, which usually stays in place, and that's what happened in this case. And there you go, shiny new 31 primary squirter. Now, like me, you may be concerned that the power valve is blown out in this thing thanks to all that horrible backfiring. That's definitely possible, although newer Holley-carbs like this one have a check valve in the power valve feed. It's called blowout protection, and it's supposed to prevent that from happening. I don't know that that's 100%, but what I'm going to do for now is assume it's fine until proven otherwise. If it seems horribly rich and untunable, we'll go in and change the power valve. But from what I've seen so far, I think it's okay. Already, much better. Still a light stumble. Let's see what the timing looks like. Did you hear it cough? That's what it's always done. This is terrible. I'm hoping I can get that tuned out, but we're gonna find out. This thing is sounding pretty sweet though. Not perfect, but pretty sweet. Wow. Okay, this thing's set at 15 degrees base, assuming the timing mark is right, which I am not guaranteeing. 43 degrees total, which is a little much, let's say. That means this thing has a 28 degree spread, which is just insane. Also, I didn't verify the timing mark. I should have done that with the number one plug out, but yeah. Anyway, 28 degrees is too much. Like, way too much. Now, the coughing out the carburetor can be an indicator that an engine wants more base timing. 15 doesn't sound far off for this thing. It's a super mild RV style cam. It should be about right, and yet it still coughs. But I'll tell you right now, 43 degrees on top is way too much. We need this thing in the 35, 36 neighborhood. This is a relatively low compression engine, big chamber. It should take that, no problem. What we really want is to recurve this distributor. It's a common performance move. It's something I've shown on the channel many times. It's not what I was here to do. You know, I've already improved it quite a bit. I am somewhat concerned that if I just back the timing off to something safe and leave it that way, it's gonna idle like crap and probably pop out the carburetor even more, and that wouldn't be great. So I'm gonna have a conversation with the owner and we'll decide what we're gonna do. Not long ago, I did the big ballast resistor video thingy on my channel, where I talked about how they work and how you bypass them. I never mentioned anything about the 4-pin style, which would have come factory in this 73 car, so I wanted to show you this real fast. It's pretty easy to figure out which two you need to jump. It's the one that has 2 blue wires and the one that has 2 brown wires. Notice this little connecting wire is missing. I don't know why that's been cut out, but it has. That green wire with the red tracer powers an extra circuit in the original 5-pin module. So in most cases these days, you don't even need a 4-pin ballast. Anyway, your bypass should look something like this, although you can feel free to do a slightly tidier job. Hey, what do you know? Adding that missing screw to the passenger side blinker running light housing made that light do stuff, so that's cool. I've only just noticed this valance is a little crooked. Hey, I said it right. You're welcome. There you go. I even made it slightly less crooked. Also, I'm only just now noticing how smashed up the radiator support is. That needs some hammer treatment. That's definitely beyond the scope of this video. Pretty sure we'll have blinkers now. Nope. Wow. Okay, hold that thought. Apparently we have like a neighborhood mini bike gang now. Jealous. Anyway, you just saw me testing the brake and turn signals. We still have no blinky even with the fronts fixed. There seems to be no power getting out to the bright sides of those sockets, so that's a whole other thing I gotta figure out. But back here in the back, I've got power to the left. On the right side here, the bright does not work, so I imagine that is a grounding issue. Note, it does light up when you hit the right turn signal, but it's not bright. You may have noticed someone has put ridiculous bright conversion LED bulbs in this thing, which just in general is not a good idea. I kind of thought the issue might be in the contacts between those bulbs and the sockets. They're not actually the round type, they're like the football looking contacts. I did verify by putting power to the plug up here. That light does get bright when that happens. Here's something I've never seen in my life. The running lights are currently on. You saw me fix the front running lights. Okay, I'm gonna hit the left turn signal. It brightens the left bulb when I hit the left blinker. Okay, I'll hit the right blinker. It brightens that one. I'm sure you can kind of see things lighting up there. Here's with the running lights off. It does nothing. How does that even work? I don't understand. I think I probably need a special LED flasher. That's obvious. But even with that sorted out, like, what is going on here? I don't understand. I hate LED bulbs. I think I mentioned that. I mentioned the timing situation, and we're gonna get to that. This thing is running pretty awesome now. Like, awesome. But it still backfired and set a little fire in the carb when I went to start it. I really thought I had one of those see-through electronic style flasher modules in stock here, but must have used that for something. I'm also completely out of regular bulbs. I've got 56s for reverse lights. Anyway, I guess I'm off to buy more stuff. Swapped in an electronic style flasher, and it does exactly the same thing. I replaced the front right bulb with a normal bulb, didn't solve the problem. But now, when I hit the right turn signal and then turn it off, I hear the flasher click once. Maybe a second working bulb will improve things. So I came back here, pulled out one of the LED taillights and installed this. This brought me to another issue. I mentioned this bulb wasn't lighting up correctly anyway. Well, this could have something to do with it. This grounds through this light housing, but the fact that it does not lock in here solid means there's no solid reliable ground. I'm not sure any of these things lock in solid actually. One does, and it's the left tail light, you know, the one that works. The only reason that one's tight is because it's installed wrong. There's a flat in one position that aligns with this gap. And if you put it in that way, the way it's supposed to be, it wiggles around too. Look at these little tabs. Note, there's a section that sticks out farther. That is supposed to lock in and hold this socket tight. They aren't doing that, so I'm gonna carefully take some needle nose and bend them outward like I did that one. There we go. Much better. I can still move it, but it actually locks in there. If these lights had a ground wire, this wouldn't be an issue, but they don't. They have to ground through those tabs. Hallelujah. With the grounds back here fixed, and conventional bulbs, and throwing away that brand new electronic flasher I got in favor of the new thermal one that was already in the car, this finally works again. Just ridiculous. We're talking about 4 different unrelated problems. Front signal ground, rear signal ground, bulbs, and a goofy flasher. Just say no to LED bulbs. Get like normal bulbs. You can get fancy bright ones if it makes you feel all warm and fuzzy. There might be some LEDs out there that work, but I've never found them yet. Yay! Fixed forever. Moving on. I decided to go the extra mile, climbed under the dash, and replaced the broken left indicator flasher bulb. So there you go. So fixed. It was just totally smashed. There was no glass in it anymore. Next super fun job. Fuel gauge. Gotta try and make that work. Notice this thing has a fancy electronic style voltage limiter. That's a 5-volt voltage limiter. And I actually installed that when I put this cluster in. I think it worked, but I don't actually remember. Anyway, it's dead as a doornail now. There's 12 volts going in, no power coming out. So that thing is shot. Casey actually bought a standard replacement gauge limiter for this thing, so I'm going to try and put that in. I don't seem to have the original ground wire. I do have this one I added for the chip, so maybe we'll reuse that. The other 2 wires are just kind of floating here. On a lot of different designs, that limiter plugs into the gauges, and this would be really easy. But on this one, the wiring is all point to point, so it's a little bit more fiddly to deal with. Well, this limiter he bought is actually the wrong style. The one that's supposed to be in the E-body screws down and then has a female socket for the output that goes to the gauges. So I had to make a little adapter for that. I had to make my own ground wire for this thing. And now I'm going to zip tie that to the main harness up under the dash, make the requisite connections, and we should be good to go, as long as the gauges are good. And the sending units are good, which is not a foregone conclusion. Got the limiter in. I did zip tie it to the harness bracket up under the dash. I would have shown you that, but I was really tired of standing on my head. So, with the key on, fuel gauge is moving very slowly. Yeah, it barely moves and it stops just under the empty line. My test for these sending units is to quickly and temporarily ground the sending unit wire, which I've just done on the temperature. As you can see, it did go up. It's now falling. So that gauge should be working as well. We got to figure out why the fuel is reading so low. I have a couple guesses. Well, here's a look at the sending unit connections. They're actually right and look totally fine. You've got the wire that goes to the gauge right here. Yep. And then you've got your ground strap. Now, this is a bit of a misconception because commonly people will think the lack of a ground strap will cause the gauge not to work. That's not necessarily true. There is still a path to ground without this. Through the lock ring, even though the sending unit is mounted in rubber, this lock ring is metal. It contacts the sending unit, it contacts the tank here, and the tank can ground through its mounting straps, at least if there's no rubber on them. And well, there isn't in this car. The gauge can work without this, but it can help to have it in place. The factory sure seemed to think so. This one's here though. So one of two things is true. Well, one of three things. One, there's not very much fuel in here. Two, the float's sunk. Could be full of gas. That is very, very common. You often see them cracked. It's a brass float and they'll fail at the solders or they'll just crack for fun. Three, the sending unit itself, the sweeper, the rheostat part, is bad. That could happen, but it's less common. I'm going to test this gauge, same as I did the temperature gauge, with my power probe. And this is convenient because I was recently asked, what the heck does a power probe do? Well, it acts as a test light. It'll tell you if there's power. It'll beep at you if you turn the beep on, although I hate that, so it's usually off. But almost better than that, you can power things up with battery power, or you can ground things. And that can be extremely helpful for testing various circuits. Relays, lights, ignition parts, all kinds of stuff. The power probe is just great. So what I'm going to do in this case is put this in this, which I need more hands for, and then hold it grounded for 5 seconds or something. That should give me a high enough reading on the gauge that when I release this and run to go look, it'll still be falling by the time I see it. Tell you what, I already know that it's going to work, but I'll still do the test anyway. Notice there's voltage and then there isn't voltage. There's voltage and then there isn't voltage. The reading isn't always showing 12. It's usually 6 to 10, which is a little goofy, but I don't really trust that. This should be battery power on, battery power off, battery power on, battery power off. If we short this, that should cause the gauge to read full after a few seconds. Let's see what we got. There you go. Of course, it's going down rapidly now, but that is a working gauge. So we don't have to go any further with the circuits in the dash, the gauge itself, the limiter, the wiring to get up here. That is all good. We have a sending unit problem. Filling the tank or replacing or repairing the sending unit is not in my purview today. So with that, all the big ticket items are handled. It's time to turn my attention to the last thing, and maybe it's not the most important thing, but it's important to me, and that's that distributor recurve job. Bring me a classic Mopar project that needs weird electrical gremlins figured out and a big block tuned, or a small block, and I'm in my happy place. Because those two things are my specialty. They're two things that many people, other mechanics and talented people, just don't quite grasp. And I do. I really enjoy that. So I'm going to go back to my happy place, yank this distributor out, and recurve it. You've seen me do that multiple times on the channel, so I don't need to document the entire process. If you want to know more about it, you can go back to a video I did last year on the Demon. I believe it was called Performance Timing Curves for Dummies Like Me. And that just sort of showed the process that I go through here. A reminder for like the 1000th time, before you remove your Mopar distributor, record which way the distributor rotor is pointing and roughly which way the vacuum pod is pointing. I always take a picture. That way I can match it up when I drop it back in there and it'll be close enough to fire. Oh, also note, I think this one is one plug wire off. The pod generally on a big block is like here. I'm probably just gonna leave it be. It's not a big deal. You can point it whatever way you want as long as the firing order is correct and cylinder 1 is lined up correctly. The annoying thing on this is I can't really get to this clip. I think I mentioned this vacuum pod is like super tight. They are adjustable. Now you can't adjust the amount of advance, but you can adjust the tension on the spring in here that returns it. And it's kind of weird. You take your Allen wrench, loosening the screw in there tightens that spring all the way. Tightening the screw this way loosens the spring all the way. I've loosened it fully. It was like 8 to 10 turns, something like that. And now when I suck on this, it will actually move, although it takes a lot of effort. So that's probably good. Might need to adjust it more in the future. Don't ask me why this thing looks cracked and there's a weird black spot there. It works, so I think it's fine. Anyway, noticed some metal shavings in here, which is never good. I can't actually see damage on the reluctor wheel, but I do see that the adjustment on the pickup is way too tight. They're not touching right now, but now that the vacuum advance might actually work, it's possible that they will touch when the pickup moves. So I'm going to open up that gap. There's a spec for it. I don't remember what the spec is, but I just kind of eyeball it, as I do with many things. Yeah, that looks about right. Might be a little wide in fact, but I think it's fine. Well, this is interesting. See, the slots there are angled slightly. I'm guessing that's part of what gives this the extra degrees of advance. Notice this still has a big spring and a little spring. That's the factory setup. I'll probably pop a little spring in place of that big one. That doesn't come into effect until partway up the rev range, but once it does, it keeps you from getting your maximum advance for quite a while. I'm fresh out of light Mopar springs and I didn't want to tear apart another distributor for parts yet. So I grabbed an MSD style one and stretched that out. This should be pretty good. There is a bit of spring tension, so we'll definitely have a working curve here. It's not just going to slam open. And I wanted to talk about that. Old school hot rodding trick, you can just get rid of the big spring, like run the little one by itself, or even like stretch it like I did there. And then your curve comes right in. You've got part of your curve like at idle. Takes almost nothing to get those weights winged out. That's not the way I like to go. I like to get the base number set. You know, usually most of these hot rod engines, I'm going for 20 to 24 degrees or so. I don't want that advance curve that's remaining to come right in. I delay that to help prevent pinging. Full throttle, lower RPM pinging. That's an issue I've had in multiple engines, especially my Demon, the 360. Notice I've got a black mark on there now. If I weld the inside of the slot to about the end of that mark, that should give me roughly half of the curve this thing has now, which should be about 14 degrees. It may be a little more, a little less. Either way, we'll be in a better position than we are now. Probably should have ground the coating off. Anyway. Oh, really? Welded, filed flat, which is very important because this can catch on things, and then round filed in here to my desired dimension. This is roughly the size of the pins on the weights. You can see how much movement there is in that one and how much movement there is in that one. Much less. Maybe less than half, actually. Might file that a little bit more. There you go. Hot rod mode engage. You've seen me do this on the channel many times. It just takes like, you know, an hour or something. But it's cheap. It's way cheap compared to like buying an MSD system or something. And it's effective. Oh yeah, I did replace and lubricate the missing felt pad. I really enjoy doing these distributors. It's just simple, cheap. It's real hot rodding. One little detail, I shared this back on the 67 Charger rehab video. The reluctor goes in one of two positions based on whether or not it turns clockwise or counterclockwise. In our big block, of course, it turns counterclockwise. So note, the pin there aligns with the counterclockwise arrow. Don't worry about that hair. I'll grab that in a minute. Anyway, I've seen one remanufactured distributor put together with the reluctor wrong. It was in the clockwise position and it was supposed to be counterclockwise. And incidentally, that reproduction reluctor did not have arrows at all. I had to line up the reluctor tooth with a good one, original one that was marked like this. Note the clockwise position hole lines right up with the tooth, and the counterclockwise one does not. Anyway, just something to pay attention to, especially if you've got a car that runs slightly weird. Fun things are happening, and I'm having an interesting time wrapping my head around it, so let's go through it. You saw me adjust the pickup gap on the distributor, right? And of course I welded on it, put it all back together. Well, it won't fire. It won't backfire, it won't burble, nothing. So now I'm looking for a test spark. No test spark. I try it with the key, I try it with the coil wire sitting there, I try it with battery negative. You leave the key on, unhook the battery. Every time you unhook the battery, you should get a test spark. Nothing happens. Am I missing key power? Nope. I took my power probe and grounded out coil negative. Every time I did that and then removed the ground, I got a spark. I checked for power down at the ignition module. It's an HEI module. It's mounted to a plate there. Yeah, good ground on the body, good power into it, good circuit to the coil. No matter what's happening with the distributor pickup, we should get one spark out of that thing every time I key on and then off. And there's just nothing. It's dead. That's actually a decent quality standard ignition part. And it's just dead. I do have one possible explanation for the ignition module checking out early. As I've been doing these other tests, I've noticed that key power out to the ignition, to those lights, to the gauges is only 10.5 volts. It should be roughly the same as battery voltage, which is 12.5 currently. Now, I can't guarantee that low ignition voltage is what killed that ignition module, but it certainly can't be good for it. It's really not good for anything. You want full battery voltage to all of your accessories and such. Voltage drop can mean terribly dim headlights, and we certainly have that here, so that's not ideal either. Way back in my big Chrysler no crank, no start video, I went through the different steps that battery power has to take to get into the car and then back out to the ignition and such. I'm going to go through those now and look for voltage drop. The basic components are battery to fusible link to firewall connector to amp gauge and then out of amp gauge to everywhere else. So I'm just going to check on the back of the amp gauge, which is actually called an ammeter or ammeter or whatever the heck you want to call it. It's labeled alt in this car, so I'll just call it the alt gauge. People on the internet will love that. A commenter yesterday informed me cars don't have ammeters or amp gauges or whatever you're talking about. They have volt gauges. That is not true. Just about all cars in the classic era, like, the 30s and 40s and 50s, used an ammeter very much like this one. Chrysler just stuck with that ancient technology for a lot longer than most other manufacturers. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying it's a fact. Anyway, at both sides of the amp meter, we've got 12.7 volts. This is with the key off now. One of the next positions to check is always this ignition switch connector under or above the column. And I don't think I'm going to have to look much farther than this because that blue wire, which is the main output to the ignition, is fried. It's been hot. It's crispy. Yeah, that's not good at all. This is a very common issue. It's not at all unlikely to look under the dash of your Mopar and find that this blue wire was jumped around the ignition switch connector like decades ago. Let's confirm this failure though. Well, that's bad, but it's not going to be that simple because with the key on, I now show 11.2 volts everywhere, in and out of the switch and on the back of our lovely charge gauge. We already know from a previous measurement that the battery voltage with the key on is 12.5. A bit of drop there. Totally normal when there's a load on that battery. But seeing 11 point whatever in here after the key is turned on, that means there's a significant drop. And as soon as there's a load on that circuit, bad stuff is happening. So we need to go to the firewall connector. Well, and the fusible link. At least that's what we would do if this car had a fusible link. It doesn't. It has this chunk of wire, which has obviously also been hot. Yikes! Things are starting to make sense. We have a bunch of ugly, horrible splices in this system. Here's one. This is the main wire powering the car, which is just bad. We do have battery voltage here. 12.4, 12.5. Okay, it's close to battery voltage. There's a splice here. By the time we get to the other side of that splice and go here, we're down to 12.2, 12.1. We jump onto this other splice, 12.1. We go into this wire after a crimp, 12.0, 12.1. We go after this splice here, which I guarantee you is terrible under that tape. Now we're down to 12.0, and we haven't even gotten to the firewall connector yet. It's becoming pretty clear to me that the problem with this one is everywhere. I'm going to pull the firewall connector. We'll see what it looks like in there, and then we'll set about improving these splices, or eliminating them entirely if that's possible. The firewall connector, or bulkhead connector, has always been the Achilles heel of these Chrysler products. When you hear people cursing the electrical systems in vintage Mopars, this is why. And this is what happens to them. Corrosion and horror. I realize you can't see that at all. There you go. And the good news is, someone has been in here before and cleaned and greased that. I'm like 100% sure that someone was me. Nothing about this particular bulkhead connector is happy. For one thing, it won't stay attached to the firewall. It was held in place with a wing nut over here and like a zip tie over here. And yes, I'm 100% sure I did that in like 2017. I don't want to talk about it. Now, the thing you need to know about this car is it once suffered a mild electrical fire, which is actually a pretty interesting story I don't think I've shared yet. When I bought this car and paid good money for it, it had no gauge cluster, and the wiring behind where the gauge cluster was supposed to be had clearly experienced some things. The wires leading to the amp gauge had been completely melted and fried, and there was a new wiring harness in a box right here. The cool gills on the fenders of the car are one of the last indications, other than the VIN, that this was an original 340 4-speed rally Challenger. An e-body expert could tell you that this car should have the sweet big 4-pod wood grain rally gauges, but it doesn't. The reason for that is, well, twofold. First, that replacement harness was for the basic gauge cluster, not for rally gauges. And second, the rally gauges were missing. I bought this car off of the Mopar Ranch, which I've actually done a video on the channel, although it's been quite some time now. I paid good money for it just for bragging rights because he is not in the habit of selling things. He was willing to sell me this car, and so I bought it. Years later, after this car was long gone, he had me help him sell the other 70s Challenger that was on the property. It had a horribly smashed roof and was not in good shape. Before I sold that car, he said, "Look in the trunk. I have a memory that there's some important part in the trunk of that car." Of course, we didn't have keys. They were missing. So I removed the back seat, which revealed a giant rat's nest and a hole in the floor. And then I got the back of it out and I crawled into the trunk of that smashed Challenger, which had been sitting outside for decades, at least since the roof had come down on it. What did I find back there? A set of rally gauges. Long after this car had been sold and probably passed through a couple sets of hands, I finally found the missing rally gauges from it. This is a second cluster I found. I initially took the cluster from the car that's immortalized on my More Bad Than Car shirt to put in this car. It was even rustier and more horrible than that one. Anyway, I said all that to say, it's not surprising this car has electrical system problems. That new harness that was put in there was used and aged and not in the best of shape. It's also for an air-conditioned car, which is this whole other thing. But I made it work. Many people who don't know stuff about things love to blame all of these Mopar electrical problems on our little friend, the ammeter, which I'm told is how you say that. I'm here to tell you that is almost never the culprit. Yes, they can fail. Generally, when they fail, you lose all power. They are not in the habit of setting your car on fire without outside help. And generally, that outside help is a dead short in the alternator, which is what took the harness in this car down. Incidentally, when I installed that new harness and connected the battery terminals, it tried doing it again. And that's when I learned this valuable lesson and put a remanufactured alternator on this car. Now, if you're a Mopar guy, you've probably run into this problem before. Many enthusiasts have over the years, and the ultimate fix has been known for a long time. So I'm going to clue you in on what that is. For your low power circuits, your individual lights, your gauge senders, and even the ignition wire, this connector is up to the challenge. No problem. But for the big main circuits, the battery feed into the car, and the charge wire from the alternator, it is just not up to the task. So what you need to do is bypass it entirely. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take a chunk of heavy gauge wire, in fact, slightly heavier than this. I'm going to go from this post all the way into the amp gauge. One chunk of wire, no splices, no disconnects. A ring connector here, a ring connector in there. Then I'm going to redo this feed wire, which is ridiculous, and I'm going to put my fusible link in that circuit. Because of the way this is set up, which is totally wrong, by the way, battery power is going straight down to the starter and skipping this, so we have to take a small wire off of here. The only circuit feeding off of here is that amp gauge main feed circuit, so putting the fusible link right there will solve the problem. Note that even this heavy gauge feed wire has gotten hot. It is not a small wire, but poor connections have led to heating this circuit up. That or there was another short at some point, and if there was a fusible link here, it would have blown. That's a good thing. It's supposed to keep your electrical system from catching on fire. While I'm buying wire, I'll also try and remember to buy a new ignition module that works. I'm gonna try and drive the Demon on the street on slick tires, which I'm sure will be fine. First, I gotta fix a mail truck. Fixed. Never done a brake booster in an LLV before. Wish I still hadn't. Someone caught this mail truck in the background of another video. They asked if it was a project. Well, yeah, but not one I wanted. I actually maintain a fleet of these for the local post office. I did a video on these almost 3 years ago now. Takes a Mopar to get some Moparts, or whatever. It's all 4 speeds all the time today. It's a little cold. You know, this is not on my list for the Challenger, but I would love to fix the factory reverse light on the dash. Of course. Right on cue. Yay, we did it. Now you may ask yourself, what is this beautiful house? This is not my beautiful wife. And you may ask yourself, how do I pass my new main feed wire into the car without ruining a bunch of stuff? Easy. Remove the ruined wire. Drill an appropriate sized hole, carefully, and then pass your new wire through said hole. Nice. Pretty easy to do on this section with it hanging here. The inside section might be a little more complicated. Of course, earlier today, I carefully reattached the 2 sections of the fuse panel / bulkhead connector, and now I get to undo that. Good. Big fat red wire that looks all crispy there. Cut it, pull it, all that. Drill the hole, pass the new wire through. Is it like a good thing that this blue wire for the ignition is melted all the way to the firewall connector? I guess we'll be replacing that one too. There is a correct way to depin these connectors. Given that I'm about to drill a hole through this one, I'm not really concerned with that, so I just yanked on it. Ugh, just straight up not having a good time. Obviously, the chunk of dark blue with white tracer there, which is the main ignition 1 circuit, is fried coming out of this connector. I could bypass the connector, no problem, but it's fried up until it joins into the harness here. And the ignition wire at the firewall, also fried for the first 3-4 inches. So I could just replace that section. I'd rather go back to where these join, but it's way up inside the harness here, and man, that is just not happening right now. So I guess I'm gonna have to splice in new sections and call it good. Long term, this thing would really benefit from a new dash harness. And it's dinner time, so this is as far as I'm getting tonight. All I wanted to do was start it and check my work. But no! Welcome to Classic Cars. Enjoy your stay. It's the next day, and after 3 trips to the parts house, I think I actually have everything I need to finish this. This is a fusible link. Factory Chrysler used these things to protect the electrical system from fire, as I was discussing yesterday. This is what you can get from the parts house now. It's a gray wire, it is 14 gauge, and it says fusible link on it. Now you want your fusible link to be 2 sizes smaller than the circuit it's protecting. Our main wire here is 10 gauge. Note, the fusible link is smaller than the main wire. The idea here is, if there's ever a short, this fusible link will disintegrate long before the actual circuit does, and it'll prevent any fire or horrible scorched stuff. As I'm sure you can tell, the electrical system in this car is not exactly factory. The battery cable, as mentioned, not the original piece. Things are configured a little strangely here. I'm going to do my best version of approximating a factory system, but it's not going to be exactly the same. This fusible link actually came with a loop on one end already, which is great. I added the second one and I applied some heat shrink there. Back working under the dash here, I went over to my donor harness, which is the original from the 73 toolbox charger. It's in pretty rough shape, but certain parts of it are certainly usable. Like this is the main ignition wire under the dash. Compare it to this ruined one in the Challenger, and note, it is much larger, and it's not melted. Almost like they figured this problem out at some point over there at Chrysler. Now, this harness could have come from a different year car. I don't actually know that. I'm guessing it's an earlier E-body harness. Also, this harness doesn't have the extra fuse feed that's split off of this wire. So I'm going to use the chunk that was for that to patch the other piece around the ignition switch connector here. Patch in the piece here, and we should be good to go. Firewall connector is back in, cleaned, greased. I even put the proper kind of nuts on it, although they're slightly the wrong size. It's what I got. It's certainly better than one zip tie anyway. Okay, it's many hours later, and I think I'm done with all these repairs. You can see the one right there in the foreground that's bypassing that ignition switch connector. It's tied in here. Those are butt splices that I removed the plastic coating from, crimped, and then heat shrink. That's a nice repair for sure. And then there's another one, and it's all wrapped up in that tape now, but it goes into that firewall connector, which I have cleaned, greased, reinstalled, assembled. It's as nice as it's getting for now. You can't see I rewrapped all that wiring there, and I did not wrap in the red amp gauge feed wire, just in case it ever needs to be accessed, pulled out, anything like that. This wire that you see here, that is a wire I added like a long time ago to run the heater, and it works, so I'm leaving it alone. As I've mentioned, long term, this thing would really benefit from a dash harness. But I think we're going to be in a much better position now. Let's find out. All right, well, we're up and running. At least there are lights and things. I'm going to check some voltages and see what those look like. First and foremost, I am doing these checks with the lights on for a load. With a load on this circuit, I've got 12.2 volts here, which is the same as battery positive here. You'll have noticed that through all these different tests I've done, the number changes, but the number itself isn't the most important thing. The fact that it is the same, there's a lack of voltage drop, that is what I'm looking for. I don't know if you can see this, probably not, but I've got 12.1 at the other end of my wire going to the ammeter. I had 12.1 on the other side of the ammeter. I have 12.0 at the wire feeding the ignition switch. It's pretty much impossible for me to show you what I'm doing here, but anyway, now with the key on, I've still got 12.0 at the ammeter. That's with key on, headlights on. That's a pretty serious draw. So 12.0, okay. Right here, I'm only showing 11.7. And that tells me there is still a voltage drop issue somewhere in this harness. I'm going to check the power coming out of the ignition switch now, and we'll see what we've got there. Okay, I turned the headlights off because I do want this test to be similar to the one I did yesterday on key power. Battery voltage right now, 12.4. Voltage at ignition positive, 12.0. So we're still losing 0.4 volts, but that's so much better than what we had. Notice the red plus is actually lit up now. That's because it's close enough to battery voltage that the power probe recognizes it as such. 0.4 volts is still quite a bit. Remember, this test is slightly different than what I did a minute ago because the headlights are off, but I've got 12.2 going into the switch, which is 0.2 lower than battery power. It loses another 0.2 by the time it gets to the ignition out there. It's much better than it was, and I can't spend all day on this. In case you were curious, no, the ignition module did not magically come back to life overnight, so now I'm going to change that out, and hopefully we'll have spark again. We can get back to what I was doing, tuning or whatever. This HEI module is mounted to a plate, which is mounted to one of the front valley pan rail bolt things. These plates were made up for me by a friend many years back now. I think I have one left in the collection. It works. It would be more ideal to mount this off the engine and ideally on an aluminum heatsink, but generally speaking, I haven't had many problems with this setup. Our wagon has had the same module on the engine in the same position for years and years, and it's never been a problem. Notice this thing has a direct ground wire going to that bolt. That's cool, but like it grounds through the plate right here. The wire goes right here. As long as the bolt's tight, that wire does nothing. Anyway, I'll leave it there since it's already been made. It is important that these modules be well grounded. Important point when you're going to do this, you've got to clip the little tit things off. If you don't, this doesn't sit flat against that metal it's mounted on, and you have essentially no heat sink. There you go. Problem easily solved with flush cuts. You see these HEI modules come out of a mid-70s GM distributor. The pins locate it, lock it in place in that distributor to line up the screw holes. When you're just bolting it to a plate with no holes for those pins, they can't be there. You ready for the dumbest thing you've heard today? This was not an ignition module problem. It's a distributor pickup problem. Recall, I reset the air gap for that pickup because it was very nearly touching the reluctor. it shouldn't be able to touch the reluctor. There is supposed to be a gap. So I backed it off, just a tiny hair. Gave it a tiny little air gap. Doesn't work. So I loosened the hold down screw. I pulled it back in and made it almost touch again. Rocked it back and forth. It still doesn't spark all the time. It sparks occasionally, but it doesn't spark all the time. Here's a working small block distributor I took off of something. There's a good look at the air gap on that one. It should be something like that. The thing you got to understand is this pickup plate moves. It cannot be super, super close to the reluctor. But for whatever reason, the distributor in this 400 doesn't like that idea. So now I'm gonna have to find another pickup, I guess, which is great. And all this after the nice things I said about the Mopar distributor. Well, that one's in pretty good shape. Just in case you're thinking that I'm an idiot and this is all my fault because I eyeballed that gap, the gap is supposed to be between 8 thou and 11 thou. This is a brass 10 thou feeler gauge. You're supposed to use the brass because it's non-magnetic. Anyway, when I line up the reluctor tooth, which I don't have enough hands to do right now, this 10 thou feeler just barely fits through there and actually does make contact. So the gap is probably set to around 9.5. Nice. Not bad for an eyeball. And again, at that distance, it doesn't work. That's a bad pickup. Now, the unfortunate thing is the pickup is adjustable with this screw over here, but it pivots on a rivet right here. So you can't just unscrew it and pull it out like a set of points. It's very obnoxious, but I actually have to pull the reluctor wheel back out and pull that entire plate. Huh, this one's actually not riveted. It pivots on a little pin, just like a set of points. That's nice. The one on my donor, unfortunately, is. So I guess I'll be drilling that out. This is my donor distributor. This used to run in my 68 Charger. It's got a bad vacuum module on it, and of course it hasn't been recurved, like the one I just built for this, so I'm just gonna grab the pickup out of it. This one seems to be great. And I know it's great because, again, it drove me around for thousands of miles with no issues. So there is something else bothering me here. I mentioned I was not getting a test spark out of the module. That's why I replaced the module. This one won't give a test spark either. So I guess the brand new standard ones just don't? Good to know, I guess. If you know things about electronic circuits and such, you may be wondering about a resistance check to make sure the pickup that I had is actually bad and this one's actually good. Well, I thought of that and I researched numbers. None of these matches what those numbers are supposed to be. And I've got a nice fluke multimeter here. In any case, I've tested them on the car. That one works, that one kind of works, and that one's garbage. I'm going to take the one that works, whether the numbers say it's correct or not. Actually, there's kind of a larger point here for diagnosis that I want you to understand. When you're having an issue with an electronic component, you can find specs for a resistance that you should read in that component. So many times over the years, I have tried to do this. And every single time, with an exception or two here or there, the results I get don't match those numbers. The only thing that has worked for me is comparing to a known good part. Sometimes that'll be useful. In most cases, though, I try to find a practical test, hence popping another distributor in and spinning it. That gives me positive confirmation that one works and one does not. Okay, here's our recurve distributor with the pickup installed. And what do you know, it actually works now. Great. Everything's back together. Keep in mind, I eyeballed the distributor. I have not been able to set the timing yet. Hopefully it's close. Don't know. Anyway, here's to cold start and no fireballs. Oh, some gas might be a good idea. All right. Remember, it's dead cold, little tiny cam, no choke, untuned, and it sounds this good. All right, we'll get to the timing in just a second. Gotta let it warm up a bit. Okay, my random stab was 28 degrees base, which honestly with the recurve, that's probably very close to the same position the distributor was in. We need to back that off to something like 20, and then we'll see what the curve actually is. Hot rodding secret. Well, two secrets. The first one is don't put your hand in the fan. The second one is snug your distributor down, but leave it just loose enough that you can adjust it easily. That's too much. Given that the engine started to dip pretty seriously at 20 degrees, I'm not so sure I trust this mark. Okay, 24 degrees base, 38 total, so we've got a 14 degree spread. I think 38's a bit much. So I'm going to time this thing at 22 base. That'll give us 36 total. Now, I happened to check this with the vacuum still connected because I wasn't thinking about it. I can tell you the vacuum advance is certainly working now. And with the vacuum attached, it went to like 56 degrees. So that's an 18 degree vacuum advance. Wow. Usually they're like 9. I think I'll be tightening that thing back up. I tightened the vacuum advance screw a couple turns. I think the total travel for that thing is something like 8, so hopefully that does something. Of course, because race car, we could just run without it. Also, I could have done the birdsong thing and switched the vacuum advance to working off manifold vacuum and rearranged the timing curve to account for that, but that's not usually the way I like to go. This should work really well. Now, the other encouraging news is, so far, the carburetor has not lit on fire when I've tried to start this engine, and I'm really hoping it stays that way. I don't want to be the guy to bubble the paint in this hood. It's been perfect most of the time, but it gave me one little pop, which is still not great. More than likely, that is an intake valve issue. Every so often, one intake valve in this engine is hanging open. When it does that, the combustion is lit off in the chamber and it works its way up the intake track. It burns everything in the intake and blows out the top of the carb. I did the head gaskets on this engine years ago, and at that time, I'm sure I at least glanced at all the valve springs. If there was like an obvious broken one, I probably would have done something about it. Most likely, this thing just needs a good valve job. Fresh springs are probably a good idea too. That's not happening today. Right now, I can tell you this thing runs way better than when I started. Probably good enough to get down the road for a long time. In the future, it's going to need some more attention. And that is in the plan for this car. For now, I'm going to call it good. Air filter, back in place. This thing had a spacer under it when it got here. I don't really know why that is. This thing's got a drop base on it. It's designed specifically to fit one of these double pumper Hollies. The owner said it might have been hitting the choke or the throttle or something. Yep, that's what it was. It hit the big Chrysler throttle stud. Well, that's fixed now, and the throttle moves freely here. Fixed forever, basically. Not perfect by any means, but more than a little better than when it got here. Let's take this thing for a ride. And by take this thing for a ride, of course, I mean, let's fix more stuff off camera. Oil light didn't have a bulb in it. Let's see if it oil lights correctly. Maybe that's why there's no bulb in it. Yep, oil switch is bad. I unplugged the wire and the light turned off. Add that to the list, I guess. This thing definitely has oil pressure. I mean, listen to it. Okay, now I've been reminded of something I noticed when we pulled it in the shop. There's no clutch pedal free play, which means the bearing is probably always engaged to the pressure plate. It might not even be releasing the fingers fully. That can make the clutch slip, which is not good. I'm never getting out of here, am I? This video is not about adjusting the clutch in your Mopar with headers. If it was, there would be more bad words in it. But it might be a video about snowballing projects. Like so many other things, the list is just always longer than you think it is. Have I mentioned that this sucks? Should probably grab an offset wrench. I simply do not have time to notice that the 4-speed leaks gear oil. Oh yeah, and about making that reverse light work on the dash. Gonna be hard to do with no reverse light switch harness. You know, the more of this car you see, the more you might be thinking, gee, Jamie, you weren't much of a mechanic 6 or 7 years ago, were you? Well, I certainly didn't know then what I know now. We all gotta learn somehow. But there's another important detail to this that I want you to remember. I didn't build this car to sell. I put this car on the road to enjoy. And enjoy it I did. I might have done a few burnouts. You know, just a few. We won't be doing that today. You may have noticed that the belt squeals now. That's how you know a car's been tuned correctly. it suddenly revs quickly and ferociously enough to slip the alternator belt. So I've only just noticed there are no seat belts in this car. You know, I'd like to have a seat belt, saying. The fact that the phone fell over immediately does not bode well for, you know, testing the power in this thing with the camera. I've just been reminded the shifter handle is loose as well. This should be a clip style, but I'm pretty sure it's been converted to a 2-bolt, so I could fix that. That was on my list as well, but I forgot. Turn signal works. That's nice. Alright. We're going to modestly test the acceleration. It's not bad. That is 8 relatively happy cylinders in a big block Chrysler engine. Nice. The steering wheel is very crooked. The front end pulls to the everywhere, and it doesn't feel good. This thing needs some stuff in the front suspension. I'll just tell you that right now. I don't know if I mentioned this, but the front sway bar is missing. There are no ears to mount the sway bar end links on the control arms. I'm in 4th gear. It's not impressive from a lug in 4th gear, but the power is acceptable. It's really not bad. Okay, this thing handles bad, not good. Yeah, front end rebuild, modern alignment specs are like an alignment at all. That'd be a good place to start. Tell you what, the brakes are great. Oh yeah, that is a good power disc brake setup. There's no parking brake cable in this car, so I did have to shut it off. I'd hate to roll it into the river. You may or may not have recently seen my 1981 Dodge Challenger video, where I revived that car and then drove it to this very spot. Incidentally, no one watched the driving portion of that video. Is it because my face was in it? I don't know. This machine is a little different than a 1981 Challenger. Just a little. The big block under the hood, which incidentally is, of course, not a 383, is definitely a part of that. Yeah, the V8 rumble's definitely an important part. Big blocks, you know. 4-speed's great too, although 5-speed in the other car, that's neat. Obvious differences? The lines, the character, the presence, the style of the E-body. It's just super cool. And I like it in black. It's just the right amount of sinister. Yes, it's a late Challenger. It's a frowny face car. These things do not get any love from enthusiasts. It's amazing what a 1973 Barracuda, just a base round taillight 73 Barracuda, is worth compared to one of these cars. And I don't understand. Well, I kind of understand. When they're painted body color around the grille, that I don't like. The first thing I did when I owned this car was flat blacked that whole area. And I gotta say, it very much improved the look. I actually kind of like the late Challenger taillights. You know, the 70 or the 71 designs are definitely cooler, but I think these are nifty. The 70s Tastic Rally's strobe stripes on the side, well, those don't hold a candle to the 71 RT stripe. But it's still got the lumpy Rally hood. It's still got the same body lines. It's still got essentially the same interior, the awesome dash. All of the things that make an early Challenger great, this has those. They just don't get the love that a 70-71 Challenger gets. Or a CUDA at all. So if you want an E-body, and trust me, you probably do, allow me to present to you the 1973 Dodge Challenger. Super fun car. Handsome look, just as soon as you black out the frowny face grille. I know it's obvious, but I'll say it again. This car is a work in progress. It's not going to be fully restored by me here today. Man, I just can't go anywhere. A subscriber stopped and said hi. Anyway, where was I? Big block, I think. One of the big things I wanted to accomplish on this test drive was listening for pinging. Now, I've discussed pinging in many videos, and I keep getting questions about it. The best way I can describe it is it's a high-pitched rattle that you hear from the engine compartment, not through the exhaust. You'll hear it up here in front of you, specifically under heavy load. Say if you're lugging it in like 3rd gear and you just floor it. If you hear a sharp zzz sound, that's probably pinging, and it's likely a sign that you need to back the timing off. I didn't hear any of that on this drive, so I feel pretty good about it. Also, I was kind of holding a camera and I didn't test it thoroughly, so I will do that again on the way home. But I think we're safe as far as timing goes, and this thing sounds really good. What do you think of the wheels? The forged weld racing alloys. I don't dislike them. On the shiny black, I think it makes a lot of sense, but I always had slot mags on this car and I miss those. I just got hollered at again. Everybody loves the Challenger. Anyway, I think I was talking about wheels. They look good with the black. You know, it's got that kind of modern muscle look. I truly have no idea what's going on with the front end. It did not drive like that when I owned it. This thing was confident on the road. It went straight and handled pretty nicely. Obviously, someone has fiddled with some things. I know the ride height has been messed with a bit, so that might have something to do with it. Front end overhaul and an alignment. Definitely going to be a good idea. Until then, I'd keep the 70-mile-an-hour blasts on back roads down to a minimum. Just kind of my thinking on that. God, how much do you love the rally hood on the Challenger? It's the best. The pistol grip shifter, also the best. That's just an essential part of an E-body. Yeah, I need to tighten the bolts, so I'll go ahead and do that when I get home. Anyway, I guess that's it. That's my part on the Challenger done for now. It's always possible we'll see this thing again in the future. Until then, I'm pleased, and I hope you are too. In any case, as ever, thank you very much for watching. And remember, everything is good. Well, till it isn't anyway. Whee! All right, lumpy Challenger rally hood. Second favorite view from the driver's seat. With the first being the Charger, of course. As soon as I finished my test drive, I called Casey, the owner, to let him know this thing's ready to rock. And he said, oh, awesome, cool, okay. Hey, you don't happen to have a spare Sure Grip center section, do you? Well, yeah. You want to sell it? Yeah. So, we're going to up the awesome factor in this car by several points. Tune in to the next episode to see that. Why?